Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So joined today by Don Hanlon Johnson. So Don is really a granddaddy of the somatics and embodiment movement. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. This man has forgotten more about embodiment than I've probably ever learned. He's got several books published, including a couple on my shelf, such as Bone, Breath and Gesture, The Body and Psychotherapy, but one just called Body, just Recovering Our Sensual Wisdom. He started the Somatics graduate program in 1983 at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He's an ex-Jesuit. This man's CV is as long as your arm. I am both happy and honored to have you here, Don. Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to be back with you.
So you're calling us in from California today, right?
That's right, from the sides of Mount Tamalpais across the Golden Gate Bridge. Beautiful,
beautiful. I know the area is a good Aikido club there. So why don't we dive into this? So how did you get interested in the body?
Strangely enough, through my Jesuit training. I had a very weird master of novice, an infamous master of novices, who believed in the ancient doctrine that if we indeed were holy, we would achieve the immortal body of Jesus. So it's really important to take care of our bodies. So in our preparations for being Jesuits, he read endless texts from the lives of the saints who are achieving extraordinary body states, flying in Tuscany over the Apennines and such things. And he particularly was interested in people like Angelo Foligno, whose body never decayed, according to the lore of old Italy. So that was the first taste I got of such ideas, and that set me on my path.
And I, in preparation for interviewing you today, I looked at the interview you did with the late great Emily Conrad, and yes. You tell some of the story there. And sort of long story short, it seems like that collided with the 60s and drugs and sex and the
rock and roll, right.
Early 60s scene.
Yes, the Jesuits sent me to Esalen. I got theological credit for my first workshop at Esalen. And there I intersected with Michael Murphy, who had a very similar background. So he set on his path because of Sri Aurobindo's interest in the immortality of the body. So from that angle, and he was also peripherally interested in the lives of the saints and also in high-performance athletes as achieving immortal flesh. So we both were kind of intersecting around these strange ideas of immortality that eventually I encountered now in China with the old Taoists. So.
And this podcast, I'm imagining, will be something of a history lesson to many of the kind of younger generation of people who've come to embodiment kind of freshly through yoga, through my work, through many of the things today. And they might not be aware of Esalen even as a place. Now, if they're listening to this in Russia, for example, and, Russia wasn't open. I know I have a following there. So it'd be good to talk a little bit, or a lot even, about Esalen and that scene with people like Michael Murphy and the human potential movement and what happened in the 60s with embodiment.
Sure. That's a very rich topic. Just to start from the present, Michael now is in Moscow at this very moment. So Esalen's had a long relation with Russia. Michael started, and his wife Dulcie started what was called a citizens diplomacy relation with Russia during the Cold War. So there were several Russians coming to Esalen. I have long interviews on Russian television, actually, about my work. And this is another corner on the immortality of the body. So the Russian Orthodox Church has a long history of interest in the immortality of the body. So anyhow, that's kind of a riff.
So what is Esalen, for those that have never heard of it?
I'm about to tell you that. So Michael's grandfather, who was a physician in Salinas in the inner valley of California, bought a vacation property on the Big Sur coast in the late 1800s and built 2 houses there for his family. one very big house and one very small house. And they used to spend holidays there, right on the cliffs of Big Sur. And when Michael went to college, he spent a year in Aurobindo's ashram in India. And he and Dick Price got this vision of using the property as a way of gathering wisdom teachers from all over the world to gather and support them in spreading their teachings more broadly and in a communal aspect. So he asked his grandfather, and his grandfather gave him part of the Esalen property. So it's a very, very large piece of property, about maybe 10 miles along the Big Sur coast. And Esalen has a small part of it. And this is its 50th anniversary this year, I think. Let's see, 50, something like that. Started 50 years ago with Michael inviting a brilliant woman, Charlotte Selver, to give the first workshop in sensory awareness. And so it started in 65. That was in 65. And I went there the first time in 67, paid for by the Jesuits. The Jesuits thought this was a good spiritual thing for me to do. And he gathered together people like Alan Watts and Houston Smith and lots of Asian people from China and India and Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Alana Rubenfeld, all kinds of people came there really very early on.
So there'd been a kind of European tradition of body psychotherapy coming out of Reich. But then there was this rebirth or renaissance, and really there was a collision of the psychotherapists as well. So there were people like Gestalt therapists, for example, there.
Yes, well, Fritz came there. Fritz came out of South Africa. So he had to escape Germany, went to South Africa, and then came to California. And Michael invited him to. So he lived at Esalen. So he was kind of,
And there were martial arts people. There was like one of the early Aikido classes, people like Bob Nadeau maybe, and also dancers. So Gabrielle Roth of Five Rhythms fame.
Yeah, and Anna Halpern was on the early team.
So this must have been a pretty special place and time with these coming together of so many kind of embodiment teachers, and the field of somatics or embodiment or whatever we want to call it being reborn in the West in this way.
Yes, it was an amazing time. It was really an amazing time. It was hard to appreciate at the time how amazing it was. But you had, in the early days of Esalen, the workshops were not kind of sequestered as they are today. Lots of leaders would go to other leaders' workshops. So there was just lots of cross-fertilization among all of these people. And that's why I was able to kind of gather a field there. It was I could invite all kinds of people there, scientists and philosophers and theologians who wanted to go to Esalen. They didn't want to go to someplace in San Francisco or New York, but they would love to come to Esalen because of the beauty of the property and the wonderful atmosphere there. So it was that possibility of hosting lots of different people in a really wonderful atmosphere where their arguments could be softened by good food and beautiful scenery.
in the hot tub overlooking the waves breaking on the Pacific waves breaking on North America. Yeah,
the ideological divisions kind of dissolved in the hot tub when everybody was naked.
Well, I've heard a few wild stories from the hot tub, one involving Moshe Feldenkrais and a young lady, but as I understand it, it was pretty wild, and there was plenty of drugs and sex and as well as a meeting of ideas going on there.
Yeah, I'd say that the lurid aspects were more played up by the press, but in fact, it was more serious than that in a very profound level. I think it's easy to kind of look at the lurid aspects of the bath, but I jokingly said a minute ago, what is actually quite moving is that when you were with these great people who had very strong ideas and argued all the time, naked in the hot tubs, people could get more conversational. They got more off their high horses and were able to realize, oh, well, here we all are in our naked flesh here together in the hot baths with everything hanging out. And it was, it created a humility that's hard to get in the city.
Yeah, that makes sense. It was a great equalizer, I guess. And as you said, with the sort of natural beauty there. Yeah. And, for me, learning about some of this work in the 90s in the UK, it was Northern California particularly was a sort of bit of a mecca and I went and stayed on Strozzi's ranch, and I went to different dojos, Wendy's dojo, and different different people that were in that scene. Gabrielle Roth kind of passed through where I was at the time. And it was, very much a kind of epicenter for that work. And I think still probably has the highest concentration of somatics teachers, maybe Boulder's coming close now, but California is still a bit of an epicenter for this whole work, right?
Yeah, I should, in case your viewers don't know this, we're in the midst of a terrible disaster there. The biggest landmass movement in the history of the state happened this last winter, just south of Esalen, cutting off Highway 1. A huge mountain just moved right out into the ocean and really wiped out a whole section of the highway. So the south entrance to Highway 1 is cut off. It's been cut off, and it's cut off indefinitely. The northern route came by way of Carmel, and a huge bridge north of Esalen was wiped out. And that's was supposed to open next week. It's been out for several months, but that's now indefinite. So the only way you can get in there now is over a very windy road that's quite a bit, adds a couple hours to anybody's trip to Esalen.
Wow, okay.
They had to fire 150 staff at Esalen. They're down to like one workshop a week. It's a very serious blow to the whole coast. I mean, many people whose lives depend on working there for the tourists, they're gone. Their jobs are gone. They've had to move out of the coast. So it's a really sad story.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I know there's been fires as well, haven't there, of late?
Not so well, yes, but the floods are really this year the floods. Next year the
floods, locusts, frogs falling from the sky.
It's California, earthquakes, fire, floods.
It's all there, isn't it? It's all there. And from those times, is there any particular teachers who really, I mean, you've already mentioned a number of, like Anna Halperin, like a number of greats, Fritz Perls, and Feldenkrais was there. I mean, Alexander Lowen, maybe. I mean, who stands out for you as some of the sort of who really stands out for you of teachers that are there that you really?
Well, of course, my main teacher was Ida Rolf. I did my Rolf training at Esalen. So Ida came there a lot. And Fritz Perls, I don't know if you know the history of Ida, but Ida was sort of an obscure person working in her little apartment in New York, and Fritz Perls. I had a session with her when he was in deep trouble about something, heart disease, and he was so struck by her work, he got her to come to Esalen. So she came to Esalen and was doing individual sessions for $25 a session. And people said, wow, this is incredible work. So they asked her to teach. So Esalen and Michael were responsible for her beginning to teach her method.
And
until then, she taught a handful of osteopaths.
And so you're actually the first Rolfer we've had on, and I'm aware that the audience, some people listening to this are martial artists, some are dancers. They might not be aware of what Rolfing is. Could you sort of say briefly what that method is?
I'd say now the way that because of the recovery of the ancient or the old practice of osteopathy, most people know of osteopathy. Ida was raised within the osteopathic community, which was outlawed at the time because the AMA, with Flexner and Gates, managed to have their kind of practices of touch and manipulation outlawed. So there was a whole band of undercover osteopaths going back to the 19th century in America, who were practicing in the middle of the country. I knew several of them in Santa Fe when I lived in Santa Fe. And Ida was in that tradition. She learned how to do this deep manipulation of the connective tissues of the body to circulate the cerebrospinous fluid and to drastically improve mobility, breathing practices, all that. So she, like many of the osteopaths, were just they were having to do their work in secret, basically. And then when Fritz invited her to Esalen, she situated herself in the middle, suddenly, in the middle of all of these people who were doing all these other kinds of things. And she herself, as a young woman, she had a small inheritance. She traveled all over the world and studied all kinds of brilliant teachers herself. So being at Esalen gave her time to kind of develop her own synthesis of what she had garnered over these years. And our classes were fabulous. Everybody in those early years, they were, nuclear physicists and architects and philosophers and theologians. The dialogue was a formative dialogue every day in our classes where people were really thinking through what is her work about. And so we were doing these deep hands-on work and on each other and on people coming to be our guinea pigs. And it was a very exciting exploratory time.
It's known as being very deep work, isn't it? In terms of I remember once I was getting a session from someone and I looked down and their hand was kind of in my diaphragm up to the third knuckle. Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is, I've someone's hand right deep inside me. Yeah. Rolfing's sort of somewhat famous for that, isn't it?
It is, and it's there's certain kind of confusions about it because so I had many sessions from Ida, and it was not very painful. Mm-hmm. You would go really, really deep, but the problem with Rolfing, unlike a lot of things, is the depth that's required to do the real Rolfing, which is to move these deep fascial planes in the body, to really realign the structures of the body. You have to be extremely skilled to do that without pain.
Yeah.
Most of us, because we were so raw, we were kind of digging our way in, which caused a lot of pain. But I've been raw. I get raw once every month or two, and I have forever. And I get as I age, I'm so grateful for it. But it doesn't really hurt at all because my rolfer is so skilled. He just gets his hands right and glides right into the deep parts of my innards.
Yeah. In this case, I was quite surprised to see how deep the hand was because it wasn't, it felt penetrative in an unusual way, but it didn't feel, it wasn't painful, it wasn't screaming. Fascia's kind of it has a bit of a resurgence in the yoga world the last 5 years or so. And it seems like that's sort of the fascia's kind of become the trendy topic in yoga and anatomy at the present.
It's interesting. I think it's kind of a cultural movement that Rolfing was somewhat responsible for. There were only, when I studied Rolfing, there were only 2 medical books on the fascia. So with all the books with muscles, bones, all of the systems of the organs, all of that, there were only 2 books on fascia. So there was very little studies of fascia. And yet our whole body's basically the matrix of all of the body parts are the fascia. So these large planes go all the way through the body connecting us. So it's kind of an amazing thing that it really was not until the last 50 years or so that people began looking at fascia seriously. It was hard to figure out, why bother with it? It was like...
And there was also kind of an East meets West thing going on, wasn't there? I kind of almost imagine people from Europe coming to America and, settling there and then making their way west and sort of Big Sur's the last place you can possibly get to right on the coast. And it's almost, I almost imagine sort of California being the launch pad and people go from there into the inner world or the outer world. And these meetings of East versus West, you would literally be in the East if you kept going right into the ocean.
Well, I think that's very accurate because you remind me that while Esalen is being built, Suzuki Roshi came to San Francisco and started the Zen Center, which was a huge thing. And so you had the whole beat. Gary Snyder and all of the beats went to Kyoto. So there was, as you say, California was sort of this kind of meeting ground between these 2 movements, one into China and Japan and the other and India, and the other into Germany and the Soviet Union and into the Middle East with Gurdjieff and all of that.
And also in terms of the arts, so there's sort of Western therapeutic traditions. You talked about scientists dialoguing with people, kind of Western orientated physicists and things, and but therapy very much a Western tradition. And then that meeting, the meditation and the martial arts, and how those things came together. And I feel like that's only just. I mean, you guys were way ahead of the curve there, and that's only just coming to maturity in the wider world. This kind of meeting of East versus West and how these things, yoga's having lots of narrative now around science and are things anatomically correct and is this intelligently taught from a Western point of view, and is the guru system necessarily the one we want to be adopting in Western yoga, for example? And, martial arts is just sort of growing up a little bit. We had Miles Kessler, a martial arts teacher from Tel Aviv on here, and he was talking about the Eastern traditions of he stayed in Japan and did martial arts, but now he's in Israel. And he's from Texas originally. Right. He's trying to put all these things together.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking a lot about Bonnie Cohen today because I'm teaching a class on her today. And one of the things I love about Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen is that I think she's, of all the people I know, I think she's the one that's constructed what I would call a systems approach to the body, where her basic, put it in one sentence, she says, each element of the body, each body system, each organ has its own mind. So that if you cultivate, say, the lungs, you get a particular kind of consciousness versus cultivating the heart, which gives you another kind of consciousness. So her framework is very forgiving of all of these differences. It kind of situates how you could have all kinds of different schools that are expert in one or another region of the body.
She's really one of the top people in the world as far as I'm concerned. And she touched me once and made a very small little adjustment and completely sort of gave me a radically different experience of embodiment. I was arguing, I was in one of her workshops, I was being very intellectual and argumentative, which is typical for me. And she said, come here, very softly, and sort of touched me and turned my whole body into this completely receptive, kind of thing. And I was like, what just happened? And I was like, if you're the granddad of embodiment, she's the grandmother. And if we can get her on the show, it would be a bit of a coup. So I'd love to get her on the show at some point. But, body mind centering is fabulous. And there are people connecting that with yoga and other things. And as you say, it has this system of, like I'm fairly muscular and other people are more in the skin and other people are more bone, It's an interesting model. And sometimes on this podcast, we keep it a little interactive. So people listening may be walking or, they might be riding the subway in New York, or they might be driving a car in France. And it's like, how is it to feel those different systems, to be present as bones as you walk, or to be present as, keep your eyes open if you're driving, to be present as the muscles or the skin or the organ systems. So, is anything to offer as a sort of experience of that for people?
And it adds a certain sanity to a world of overblown claims. So, for example, with Bonnie, she honors both extreme sports and fast movement and loud sound, as well as quiet sitting, stretching and all that. So everything has a place. She is, in her view, everything has a place.
She's done a lot of different things, hasn't she? From circus to martial arts.
Right. And so to argue that, well, this system is this is the real way, it kind of dissolves in her system, which is wonderful to create more of a community of work.
And this is where I think Esalen was ahead of the times, because it was this collision of different things. And then what I saw happen around the world is people, when I started with embodiment 20 years ago, it was like, well, you do Aikido, but we don't even do karate, let alone rolfing. None of my Aikido teachers knew what 5 rhythms. They wouldn't have had a clue what that was. Right. But they have 5th or 6th degree black belt in Aikido. It's all very separate. And then I think what started to happen, and I've been part of this generation, is my generation have been doing something more like what happened to Esalen, of going, well, I do 5 rhythms on a Wednesday, and I do Hatha Yoga on a Tuesday, I do Aikido on a Thursday, and having that kind of smorgasbord of things available. I mean, let's take this podcast. People are going to be listening to this, and they may be, if they're new to embodiment, they're going to, the different schools and different teachers are all presented in one place.
No, right. Yeah, I think that it's a tribute to Michael Murphy and Dick Price that they early on got this phrase, no one is going to be allowed to capture the flag. So they had to do it. They had to fight at some point to keep, there were certain people that really tried to capture the flag at us.
That's an American game where you have to kind of win by getting the flag, and that means you kind of rule the place, right? We don't play it in England, but I've heard of it.
That's because you have a queen.
She's already got the flag. We don't. There's no. The flag's hers. There's nothing you can do about the flag now. It's a long time ago. So
there were really aggressive fights to grab the flag at us.
Different groups that tried to run the place.
Yeah. Right.
Wonderful. And I know some of my colleagues were taught by George Leonard, for example, who was another. Person involved, wasn't he, in this I mean, this wonderful idea of human potential. And in this sort of cynical postmodern world that we live in, there's something in that idea that, and it started off in your religious training, that humanity can be greater than this hunk of meat that is just crude desires, or the unrefined body, the untrained body, that humanity can be greater than that. And it seems almost a nostalgic idea now in the sort of cynical modern world, that the idea of a human potential movement that said, how, if you read some of George's or Michael's books, there was really this sort of wonderful dreaming of anything is possible and what can we do with humanity?
Yeah. It's almost makes me sad when you say that,
I
because
feel melancholic saying that, yeah.
it's so dark today, the despair about the collapse of so many things. One happy happy moment I had in the last few months, I got invited to teach in Seoul, Korea, and
Yes.
I never chosen to go to Korea unless I were invited. And I was so inspired. It was just after the election, and it's like they finally got a Democratic president. So there was this huge enthusiasm going on there, and this young spirit about all the possibilities among the people that I met there in the trainings and the workshops. And it felt like California in the 60s to me, where they had a lot of hope. So it's there. It's kind of blooms every once in a while. And my students, I have most of my students, I'd say the average age is around 30.
Mm-hmm.
It's filled with kind of inspiration and hope.
And this is at the California Institute of Integral Studies, is that right?
Yes, right.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that. But as we're sort of on the topic, also Esalen was kind of social movement type things, kind of activism, or they used to call them encounter groups, I believe.
Yes, right. So Carl Rogers was another one of my great teachers, was there, and they did a lot of work about how you create groups around the world that were not just personal psychology, but were also governance groups and working groups and task force groups. So that was a big piece of it. Carl Rogers, when I was with him, he had a Ford Foundation grant to work with an entire system in the LA basin of Immaculate Heart nuns who had hundreds of schools ranging from grade schools to high schools to Immaculate Heart College, where he had all the teachers in Rogerian groups to learn how to listen and how to do student-centered education.
And there was kind of interracial stuff going on as well, right?
Much interracial stuff, a lot of interracial stuff in Watts and in Harlem and lots of Oakland. There are lots of stuff going on like that. And also the Russian project was very big. So the Esalen was very big during the Cold War in creating lines of dialogue across the countries.
Interesting. And it's interesting again that embodiment was sort of apolitical for quite a while. And recently, again, the last sort of 5 years or so, it seems to become more political again. It's kind of blown up in yoga land in a big way. And, sort of Occupy, that era, kind of Occupy movement kind of onwards, that, when I was involved with Occupy in London, we had an Occupy London, like Occupy Wall Street, kind of analogous thing. Yeah. There was a meditation room in there and people doing yoga and things like that. Right. In a building that was squatted nearby the stock exchange. And, sometimes it's got a slightly different flavor to it perhaps now. And sometimes, if I'm honest, it scares me. And there's a sort of viciousness to the kind of politics that's come back in. But at least it's on the agenda, this sort of body. Could you maybe speak a little bit about the body politic, this idea that, or the politics is part of embodiment?
Sure. Actually, that could take the rest of our hour.
It's so done. There's so much. I'm having to breathe and center just to keep some kind of semblance of going down the track here.
Well, that's a piece I forgot to mention, that I wrote my dissertation at Yale in philosophy on the body and the body politic. And what disturbed me and why I wrote my dissertation on that topic was I wondered, for me, that if you look back at the history of revolutions, you get this continuous cycle, like Hannah Arendt says. Revolution means revolve. It means you just keeps turning around. The old oppressed become the new oppressors, blah, blah, blah. And I saw, in the light of various people like Norman O'Brown, that in some ways the body was the key to this, that somehow that going into the body was a way out of this endless cycle. And Reich saw that in his work. So Reich is really the person who started this.
So this is a student of Freud, one of the original kind of body psychotherapists, if not the original one, right?
So Reich loved Freud. He was 30 years younger than Freud when he came to Vienna, and Freud was already freaked out by all of his affairs with women and all of his patients, and had become very dissociated, was going more and more into talk, leaving his original work, which is very much centered on the body. And Reich said, "Oh, you've got it. The body is really the key to this whole thing." And he saw fascism growing of course, down the road from him in Graz with Hitler. And so he wrote this fabulous book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which analyzed the body basis of fascist systems. And the Europeans took this really seriously. To this day, there's this huge movement, which I'm sure you're aware of, sex pol in continental Europe. I taught in Naples for several years, and sex pol is very big. They have their own schools. They have their own adult education programs in sexuality. They have early childhood education based on the body.
Because Reich was big on sort of sexual liberation being part of political liberation, and that, of
and
course,
also cultivation, not just sexual liberation, but also cultivation of the body processes, and really paying close attention to body processes. But when it came to New York through what's his face, Lowen, it got personalized to the individual.
Yeah,
so it became a personal method, a personal growth thing, and the whole political aspect of body work became lost as it got digested into the, Christopher Lasch in his culture, what is it called, the narcissism, the age of narcissism, or whatever he wrote. I think he got that piece of it correct, that the focus on the individual in America kind of derailed the political importance of the body work.
Yeah, and I've definitely sort of seen work on this. And if I had a critique of kind of American embodiment, which we could say started with Esalen and has spread across the world since, is the sort of hyper-individualism which is present in the culture. It's it ranks, according to sociologists, one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. I think only Israel tops it. And it's, of course, the friend. And but it's that individualism and saying, look, it's not about politics. You just need to get therapy. You need to meditate. You need to work on stuff. And without being too provocative, it feels like coming to the present day, that sort of 60s vision has failed in this Trump in the White House. There's, on the one hand, the most kind of environmentally educated generation there's ever been. People are definitely more aware of the body now than ever before, even if it's commercialized and, say, modern yoga. On the one hand, there's this tremendous success of spreading that across the United States and the rest of the world. But on the other hand, has it influenced enough of society? There's huge sections of American society that were never touched by the whole somatic movement, right? Yeah.
It's how to recover from something. That's a very sad topic you just outlined. It's a very sad topic, and I think the truth is, as I start my way through what you're saying, to get some hope, so we don't end up in a black hole here. The things that occur to me, on the one hand, Mike Murphy has really held to that thing to this day. So he kind of kept insisting on keeping that focus at Esalen through all the midst of the waves of narcissism. And I think he was successful in keeping a steady beat going in that direction. And I was part of that. And now I think that one of the things that some of us have continually nurtured, the big piece missing are people not white in this movement. So that's the big missing link to me.
Diversity is kind of the obsession of the kind of modern generation involved in.
Well, it ought to be. It ought to be, because here we are. So this new project I've got, which I'm quite excited about, where I gathered a group of 11 people who are really diverse and helping them write their own voices about this stuff. And on the one hand, there's enormous pain about being excluded from the mainstream discourse. On the other hand, there are enormous capacities for healing here.
Yeah.
Both in the content of the healing and also in the fact they can actually voice it. And the voicing of what people of color have to offer here, and also people who stand outside the mainstream of normality of bodies, that's been missing. And I think that's created a huge problem.
Yeah, I know there's other people doing good work on that.
Yeah.
There's a woman called Stacey Haynes that does kind of good stuff in California around.
That's right. Stacey is a really good example of somebody who stayed on that line. Right. That's exactly right. And Joanna Macy, and there are a few others. Emily Conrad and I, before she died, we gathered a group of 20 people of color at Esalen, which was a great and powerful week we had, with people with very, very different voices, very different histories of pain, and very different histories of embodiment. I mean, African embodiment practices are amazing. Asian embodiment practices are amazing. So I think diversity to me is a very, very important topic right now in terms of this mess with white supremacy leaking out everywhere and male supremacy leaking out everywhere and all of that.
Great. Well, that's good to hear from you. And on the one, I feel like this conversation, on the one hand, there's a lot of joy for me to chat to you and someone as one of the founders of this work and to hear from these sort of pivotal experiences. And then, I'm also aware that bringing it to the present moment and talking, the kind of rise of kind of the white supremacists in America and Donald Trump in the White House is pain there too, right? And
right.
Acknowledging this 50-year journey and some of the things that were wonderful and some of the things that maybe haven't yet to, are still yet to be done in the embodiment world.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done.
So what do you see as the future of this? Like I was talking to a German friend of mine, she lives in Barcelona, does body work just on Skype a few hours ago. And I said, where's all this going? Like we were talking about how much personal growth work there's available now. She said, have you read such and such a book? I said, no, I haven't got time. Have you read such, there's so much stuff online on YouTube, the podcast, there's so much stuff out there. And there's also this kind of risk of narcissism that you mentioned before in this work. And you see that in some of the more sort of body beautiful aspects of dance or yoga or things that are out there. And the collision of cultures, the spreading of different ideas, other countries other than sort of the United States, which is where the vast majority of embodiment teachers have come from since the 60s. Really, I see that changing now. What do you see as potentially the future of this field?
Well, one area that I think is, I see with lots of young people, including my son, who's a world wanderer, is the unity between permaculture and bodywork. Mm-hmm. So this deep sense of cultivating both the earth and our flesh as one reality, one kind of reality. So there's a whole underground all over the world. I mean, just all over the world of people who are serious about both of those, who are kind of the community now of resistance to the virtual community, the communities of endless electronics and startups. So I think that's a helpful piece. And I think, unfortunately, the crises in the earth are going to drive that further. Now in Florida and Texas, and now coming up again today, I see a Hurricane 5 is now once again sweeping up the Caribbean.
It is a little bit biblical in the States right now, isn't it?
It's very biblical. No, it's quite biblical. I right now, yesterday, after 7 months, our whole canyon was washed out. All of our yards, terraces, patio, fences, trees moved 4 feet down our slope, all last January, just totally devastated. So just yesterday, we're starting to repair it. It's horrible. So and then Esalen, of course, is washed off the cliffs. So I think, unfortunately, as usual, we learn by these terrible dysfunctions.
Yeah.
And I think there are many, many people ready for it. Lots of people ready for it, know what to do. But it's going to be a suffering transition, I think.
It's interesting because a lot of embodiment I see really came out of the great suffering of kind of Europe in the 20th century of the wars and then people fleeing the Nazis. Yeah. And then by the time they got back on their feet, the 60s were beginning, by the time they got established, mostly in America and less extent in the UK. And, it was that great disaster that kind of led to that wave of work. Yeah. And, I wonder if sort of environmental disasters are going to create another wave.
Well, and that I think hardly anybody here knows how many people got killed in World War I and World War II. I mean, that's massive. That was a massive, massive disruption.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if the Soviet figures alone were 20 million.
Yeah,
it's just sort of and Stalin killed another 20 million on top of that. And it was a sort of traumatizing thing for the whole continent, as it were. But it's out of that kind of darkness, this sort of 60. If there was the 50s and the stabilization, and then the sort of what else is there? Let's be creative. And interestingly, the sort of as we speak on Skype in time zones 8 hours apart, the whole internet revolution also came in that same period, also influenced by psychedelics in the same space, right? I mean, Steve Jobs and people like that weren't a million miles away from Esalen and San Francisco.
Yes, but Steve Jobs was taking LSD. So
right, yeah. It's no accident. And they've got into microdosing.
We haven't spoken about that, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, the influence of hallucinogenic drugs on the kind of early days of this. But do you want to say something about that?
Latter days. Well, it's I don't know much we should talk about this publicly, but well, I guess we can now because the laws are better. But it's a major piece, and we don't talk about it very much.
Yeah.
It's a major piece because it was psychedelics that made it really utterly clear to most of us that my hand is not just a hand.
Yeah.
It was that realization, and now you have a big resurgence of elders in various tribal cultures that are sharing their wisdom with people. So many young people now, unlike us, are doing ceremonies with elders rather than just doing chemicals often.
Dropping acid at a party. Now people go to Peru. Right. We're much more international now. People go to Peru and sit with a shaman and do ayahuasca.
Well, there's something meaningful in it as well as all of the weird stuff.
Oh no, it's been seminal in my life as well. I took magic mushrooms with an old hippie guy at 14 with a couple of friends in a very sort of safe and mindful, we might call it now, environment. Yeah. And had an experience of my body kind of opening, and I kind of, my whole body felt like a kind of soft, open vagina. And I realized there was something else in the body, and it changed my whole trajectory. Yeah. And when I fell in love at 16 for the first time, it was like a kind of mystical opening, but I think it had been primed by that psychedelic experience at 14. And by the time I just, started doing martial arts at 18, it was, I was open in a way that I don't think I would have done and I only took them 2 or 3 times. We're not talking about, tripping all the time for fun, but it was definitely a factor in opening to some of to love, to the big body of the planet, to that whole field.
And I think that not many people know, but my first encounter with psychedelics was with a papal theologian, John Courtney Murray, who'd been condemned by Pius XII because he wrote a series of articles saying democracy was better for religion than a monarchy because people had a more choice.
Choose, yeah.
Condemned by Pius XII, and John XXIII rehabilitated him at the Vatican Council. He came to our Jesuit house in between the 2 sessions of the council, locked himself in a room and took LSD. It was because he was preparing for a meeting with Hutchins in the Fund for the Republic, where all these intellectuals were all experimenting with LSD and then processing it. And then he came and spoke to our Jesuit community about this mystical sense of the universe and his body and all of that. He was 65 years old from the Vatican Council. And then the next people were 2 Jesuit psychologists who were subjects at UCLA taking LSD, and they came and talked to our community. So I took LSD in the early years as part of this whole community that were exploring spirituality and the body. So they're very different.
And as I understand it, celibacy didn't survive that either.
No, celibacy didn't survive that.
Wonderful. So give us some of so we've talked about some of the modern times and some of the challenges today, politically, environmentally. We've talked about this kind of blossoming in the 60s. Kind of what did you see between those? Because you've been in this 50 years.
Yeah, right.
So what have you seen along the way has been happening? The 70s, the 80s, how becoming established at a university in the 80s, I believe, in doing this work?
I say building community. That's been most important to me and to the people I've been involved with. Is we got all these great insights, and then what? And so the issue is, how do we gather people to have better education, better research, better communication, but better social change mechanisms? So there's just a lot of work to be done. The 60s kind of opened up all the work that had to be done. Yeah. And I say the last 50 years have been kind of hard work at building community to this very day.
And also sort of integration, perhaps, in establishments. I look at kind of Naropa or CIS and places like that. I remember finding out about them while I was doing psychology and Aikido at university in a fairly conservative British university, and just going, wow, and nothing like that existed in the UK. Now I think there's at least 1 program in somatics and 2 or 3 MAs in dance movement therapy in the UK. Yeah. The integration of mindfulness, Kabat-Zinn and sort of mindfulness and that becoming established to the point where I can go into a major corporation now and teach embodiment, and it's not that weird.
Yes, right.
Meditation, it's not that weird anymore. Even 10 years ago when I started my company, it was much harder. There's been a sort of integration even in the last 10 years that I've seen, where now I'm in a company, I say, right, so I'm going to do some stuff with the body. Who's done maybe a bit of yoga? And it used to be one person. and now it's half the room. And someone else does tango, and someone else does tai chi. You know, like there seems to be an integration in society and at some of these institutions a little bit more.
But the work that has to be done is the kind of work you're doing here. Is people can do yoga all day long or mountain biking, but does it have anything to do with social values? That's the step that has to be. That's now the link that has to be made, in my opinion.
The rest of your life, right? Like
we now know that it's better if you do yoga, better for the company. Because people will be more...
You'll be more productive if you do yoga. And if you meditate, you'll be a better sniper.
That's right.
I was talking to someone from a Buddhist background recently. We were talking about mindful on another podcast, a guy called Cullen who does addiction work through mindfulness, and saying, you know, there's mindfulness is taught on pickup artist courses, sniper courses.
right.
All these kind of things. And sometimes, you know, might be some nice people or well meaningful. I've had teachers of mine that have worked with the military. I've worked with the military abroad around trauma, and, you know, often well meaning and good people, you know, but there's this removing it from the social context. So, you know, yoga as a way just to look beautiful. When I'm teaching in Moscow, for example, you know, it's quite normal for someone to say, well, I do yoga to look attractive so I get a husband. And I'm like, wow, at least you're fucking honest, you know? That's at least straightforward. I can work with that. But it's almost more nefarious when it's not honest. It's like there's a kind of a double think going on, I see, particularly in the States, but also increasingly in Europe, of doing an embodied practice and saying it's for one thing, but really it being for a much more conventional kind of spiritually materialist kind of reason. Do you know what I mean by that? Like this kind of weird double think, or this kind of veneer that they kind of believe.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
It's almost easier to work with the Russian girl who says, well, I just want to be skinny. So men like, you know, it's actually easier because I'm like, okay, great. Well, that's good. And you could also try this. You know?
I was horrified when I was invited to work in Paris for a year as a rolfer. And that's what all my clients would say. Well, I'm coming to you because I want my breasts lifted. You know, I want my skin looks better toned. You know, it's like
culturally, I find the French one of the hardest groups to work with because of this. Not wanting to look a fool and wanting to look good. That I actually find Americans, for example, much easier to work with the embodiment because there's a group of French and African, Sub-Saharan African, and French. American. There was a company, and it was in West Africa, and there was a third American, a third French, and a third Sub-Saharan African. And I did an embodiment exercise. The Africans jumped straight in their bodies, you know, like even though they're all Harvard trained, they've been dancing and drumming since they were kids, you know, a lot of these guys. I don't want to paint a stereotype, but they could move, you know. And then the Americans were like, they dived in and weren't very good, but they gave it a go. And the French just went, no. They went, we will not do it, and walked out of the room. I was like, oh shit, I lost a third of the group, you know. So there's definite cultural factors involved in this. I wonder if that's one thing that maybe the West Coast of America and it's an embodiment is sort of underestimated. Is not just the differences between ethnic groups and minority groups, but also, you know, in Europe it's very different, where we have all these countries so close together with such different cultures. And I remember when I was in California, it seemed kind of culture blind at times to me.
Yeah, I think that's true. No, I think that's true. The cultural memory is about one generation back.
And the emphasis is on the melting pot, right? You know, in a good way, but also there's another side to that. So how is it to teach on a graduate program? I mean, you know, are they like writing dissertations on embodiment? Is people coming in to do MAs on this subject? Is it very intellectual? How is that collision of the visceral with the intellectual?
Well, it's a work continually in progress. I started out my career, my non-religious career, with Carl Rogers and experimental education. So from the outset, I was engaged in big experiments in student-centered learning. And that's been a big part of my life. I've written about it and I've done all kinds of experiments on it. So our program does a lot of experiential learning. And there's a whole experiential learning is a complex thing. I suppose you've seen some of the stuff. It's not just say, oh, we do experiential stuff. It's a whole way of rethinking what texts are about and how you do texts and how you write out of experience and how you do different kinds of research and a whole thing. So our program has spent a lot of time from the outset focusing on those issues. So I'd say as CIS goes, we're among a group of programs who are very oriented towards experiential learning.
And is there a clash there with the sort of Asian traditions? Because there's another tradition of embodiment of, say, the martial arts teacher who's like, well, you just do what you're told and it's very authoritarian.
Yeah, that's a clash, and it's a problem that I'm making a little progress on because I'm finding people in China and Japan who are willing to to listen to other people. But it is a problem. I mean, that's one of the problems of weaving in a more of a communal aspect with Asian teachers because of that acculturation of saying, well, the hand belongs here.
Yeah, it's wrong. You're wrong. And also it seems to me safer because I just see there's been so many cases of Asian masters or Western Asian style masters abusing their students, right? In
Absolutely.
the West.
It's horrible.
It's the norm. It's not like the odd case, is it, with martial arts and yoga and anything that Asian model just seems to be dangerous for people in the West.
Yeah, it's another one of those depressing things where we think there's progress. There hasn't been much about patriarchy. I mean, patriarchy is very tenacious about the rights of the male teacher. It's problematic.
Yeah, built in. It's built into certain systems. You know, in capoeira, it's considered bad manners to sleep with a new student until the teacher has.
Really?
Did you understand?
Well, there you are.
It's like a cultural norm in capoeira.
There we are. Right. But just to answer your question a little bit more, I think CIS, of the many institutions I've worked in, is one of the more enlightened about the diversities of learning styles. So because so much of it comes out of Indian practices and influenced by Aurobindo, there's a lot of respect for non-literate experiential learning. That's very helpful. I'd say the negative side of it is there's at the same time there's a certain anti-intellectualism, which is a little bit like the climate deniers. I mean, it's like there's a certain fear of empirical science. Descartes is the bad guy. And this Descartes, of course, nobody real. I mean, having been a Jesuit, I love Descartes.
Descartes much benign, unfairly, I would say. It's a sort of trendy thing to say, oh, Descartes, body mind. But I wonder if this wasn't another weakness of some of that 60s kind of approach. It was all feel, wasn't it? It was feel.
That's right.
Forget about the head, forget about the mind. It's all feel.
Fritz was terrible about that.
Pissed me off in California, frankly, Don, when I was there. It used to annoy me because, I was rigorously scientifically trained at university. And it's like, we don't have to throw that out just because we're doing experiential stuff. Like people listening to this podcast, I hope they think about what we're saying critically as well as feel their bodies as they're listening to the podcast. These are not mutually exclusive domains,
Yeah, I think one of my abiding themes that I've emphasized in my teaching without thinking about it so much is I've really had to help graduate students recover language for the body. They've been really kind of taught out of it. They've been taught a dissociated language, which just doesn't do justice to their experience. And so then they just throw out all language. And so to recover the ability to really speak what they know.
And do you mean just like giving people a vocabulary for that or making it a normal thing to do? Because there's a way in which people do go non-verbal, don't they, when they are often in the body. I've taught yoga classes and I said, how do you feel? And everyone's just completely in that non-verbal space.
Right.
And it's quite tricky to actually speak at that point.
Yeah, right. Well, I've used a lot of work from poets, from street language, hip hop. I also turn a lot to the writings of people who have had language taken away from them. So, there are people in Eastern Europe were forbidden to talk. So then when they write out of that and say you read somebody whose language has been stolen from them, and you get a sense, well, I can sit here in Mill Valley and say, oh, language is for shit. Whereas somebody in Prague, they couldn't speak. They were put in jail for writing something. So.
And you will. I love it when I'm somewhere like Israel or Czech or Russia or France. So something positive about France as well. Like all those countries, I'll get these like hyper intellectual, really spiky kind of questions when I've been doing. And I think I'm like, great. Don't take it. I mean, try the work, give it a go, taste the cake. But it's also like it's really nice when people have that kind of intellectual, kind of sharp mind that I would see in Prague or Paris or somewhere like that.
Right.
Okay, so what have we covered? What's still to go? Blimey! So we've gone from
Nuclear Holocaust. We haven't talked about
the nuclear holocaust. We haven't got there yet, thank God. But you have been in Korea, so dangerous place to be. I mean, joking aside, there have been people that have said this threat of nuclear holocaust starting in the 60s, where it's a very real threat, right? With Cuba, I mean, there's one Russian submarine captain who effectively saved the planet, and the existential threat of that has had a certain embodied effect on people. And I wonder if in climate change we're not, even if we're in denial of it, we're not also deeply aware that something is deeply up, and there is an existential kind of, the sword of Damocles is hanging over all of us. And it might not be Trump and North Korea, but it might be climate change, it might be whatever it is. But there's a way in which I think people do viscerally feel that. And as I understand it, in the 60s, that was quite a thing too, with the crisis.
And I guess the question is whether the answer to that is eat, drink, and be merry, or to try to deepen and have some sense of possibility of change.
It can go both ways, can't it?
Despair and the force of these forces could just drive people into eat, drink, and be merry.
Yeah, one of the best parties I ever had was on the side of a volcano in Ecuador, in a town that got wiped out every 50 years, more or less. It was a great party town because
there you are,
because they were constantly, under this threat, and people were just like, well, screw it, But it wasn't a pleasant place, actually. It had very high rates of crime and HIV and things like that as a result. But for me, it's easy to look at this big picture and despair, isn't it? To look at who's the president or the prime minister, or to look at the environmental stuff. And I don't know how you do it, but for me, sometimes it's just like, okay, who am I teaching today? It's almost like one foot in front of the other. It's like, okay, I'm talking to Don. I'm going to learn something. We're going to have some fun. Let's do that. And then I'm having dinner with my wife. And then tomorrow I'm teaching yoga. There's that one foot in front of the other kind of approach.
Well, that strikes a chord with me, because that's true of me. I love my work. I love my family. I love where I live. And I just settle and do that. And at the same time, like you, allow the larger focus to be there. And see where the opportunities arise to do something in that direction, but not to stake my life on whether it accomplishes anything.
As you said, there's a fine line, isn't there? And like, maybe people listening to this can reflect, like when you're in your yoga class, your Aikido class, or whatever it is it a holiday from that bad things happening in the world? Or is it, the opposite extreme might be sort of trying to fix everything, like the sort of protester screaming or something, And then it's like, or is it that kind of maybe more healthy middle ground of being aware of the context of what you're doing, aware that your class might be ethnically not diverse, that maybe people can't afford that class? Like, I just give you an example. There was a yoga class near me I went to, and I wanted to see the teacher, and I went to her by donation class, and it was full of young people. And there was like 50 people there that were like 16 to 19 years old, I'd say, like late teens. And I thought, why are these people not in the normal yoga class that I go to? And of course, it was cost, because she was charging £3 or £4 a class, and normally it's £8 or £9. And that didn't seem like a lot of money to me as someone with a reasonable job now. My income's steady, but for them it was impossible. And I hadn't even realised they were excluded from the yoga class that I normally went to around the corner. And I just hadn't been aware of that until I went to that class and went, wow, shit, £10 for you is a lot of money, isn't it? As a high school or whatever it is. So easy to miss those social issues, to walk past the homeless person on the way to the fancy yoga class or whatever it is.
Also, I wanted to go back a little bit. I was going to say something a little 15 minutes ago. I think it's a very significant moment in history when Lenin screwed up Marx in terms of the body. And the way I see it is, Marx said capitalism is going to collapse. It's not a sustainable system. It's going to collapse on its own. Lenin wasn't patient. He was not patient to allow that. So he created, what we know as Russian communism, where, shifting all the farm workers and doing all these things to accelerate it. I think that's a really rich mistake to be learned from, that somehow we can't make it happen faster than it's going to happen. And to be patient with allowing certain processes to go on while staying alert. And I think it's a very delicate thing, both with ourselves and with the world, to tolerate my shit, I do terrible things. I've struggled all my life because of my personality structures. And gradually I try to whittle away to be more loving, more caring, more sensitive. But it's a hard work.
Yeah.
And the same thing's true with the world. And I think there's always this possibility of despair and giving up and just saying, eat, drink, and be merry, because I can't do anymore. So to kind of allow myself patience and ambiguity. I don't know the world. I don't think Trump and Kim Jong-un are going to blow each other up, but I don't know.
And actually, there's lots of reason to be hopeful, right? Like the Steven Pinker stuff on kind of violence being at an all-time low in the world. Now, it doesn't look that way because we were on the news and we can see, but there's the violence at an all-time low. The fact that even, let's take something that say ISIS are doing in the Middle East is now considered an atrocious war crime. Yeah. And actually, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, maybe even 500 years ago, it wouldn't have been seen as a big deal. It would have said, well, of course, you rape people and kill people when you take their land. Right. And now it's at least an atrocity, Yes, and there does seem to be some progress we're making as a species. Right. And I think as embodiment people, we could overblow our role in that and get into a kind of savior complex, Yeah. And rather than going, you know what, someone comes to my yoga class, they're going to be happier, they're going to be a little bit more in touch with themselves. Maybe I can give them a little bit of a pointer to actually, one of my yoga teachers says on the way out, please use this for the benefit of others. Just little pointers to the fact that it's not just a holiday from reality, it's a way of actually helping people. Yeah, right. And just in a small way, rather than take the whole world on our shoulders, which is sort of grandiose and narcissistic in a way as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Like me and my Aikido class are going to save the world. Right. My podcast, maybe just be a positive influence on someone. Maybe your little chat will be a positive influence on someone, having a bad day in Soweto or whatever, I don't know. But John, so I'd love you to talk about aging a bit because obviously you're not as young and good looking as I am anymore. Maybe as good looking actually. You're quite, that Californian sunshine makes you look far more attractive than me for those that are on YouTube. I mean, the grey, you can see the difference in our skin, the grey British weather here. But you're certainly, without being too rude, getting on a bit now. And so maybe you can talk about embodiment through the 60s, 70s and 80s, as opposed to, people might be listening to this as Aikido teachers in their 20s or yoga teachers in their 30s. Yeah. Tell us something about the aging process.
Sure. Well, my great beacon as I approach my mid-80s is Charlotte Selver. Do you know this name, Charlotte Selver?
Yeah, one of the really early names.
Charlotte Selver, who gave the first workshop at Esalen in sensory awareness, when she was 100, well, when she was 80, people started saying, you better go do a class with Charlotte because you're going to die pretty soon. She broke her back several times. She's falling down all the time. So when she's 100, she ran off with her 51-year-old gardener to Guadalajara. It was a scandal because the gardener had another lover his own age. And so they married and had a wonderful honeymoon. And he took care of her and was a wonderful person. And she died at 103 after 2 hours after her last class.
Wow.
When my son was born, she came over to give him a little thing when he was 5 days old. And she then was 100. And my son, who was 5 days old, grabbed her breast. And she was so happy. She was really happy. So I tell these stories about Charlotte because there's something about this work that keeps going. So it's not just rehabilitative. So the surprise for me is I feel better now than I did when I was 50.
Yeah, you look more vibrant than
when I was 40.
Yeah.
And it's kind of shocking because the numbers are there. There's certain reality to the numbers. And I know that my future is not as long as it was. But there's something, I'm so grateful that I found this field. I'm just so grateful because there's something about living a life of awakeness to my movements and sensations and pleasures that I think is a gift that I just didn't account for when I was growing up. And most of the people that of my age didn't account for. So I think there's a huge field of opening that's not talked too much about cultivating a life of eldership in this country. That's true in Asia, but not true here, at all here. When I go teach in Japan and China, the way I'm treated is totally different from here.
Yeah, even in Russia, I was with my mentor Paul Linden in Russia, and the sort of respect he gets given as a kind of elderly person is really huge there. And on the one hand, there's this worship of youth within Western culture, and from America, but England as well, and and a sort of disdain for the old, or this idea of being elderly as a sort of aging as a decaying process, essentially, is the sort of main model. And then so I see that as the sort of main paradigm. I also have some very good role models, like people like you who are very vibrant, and also Aikido teachers of mine. A guy called Don Levine was a mentor of mine at the University of Chicago. He picked up Aikido when he was 50, and all his friends said he was crazy. And at 84, one of the last things he said to me, like, all those people are dead now, and here I am throwing you around.
That's the way George Leonard was. That is exactly what George. Yeah. I think what you're saying, I think the body base, there's a body base of that. It's like, if you think of the body mostly as fitness and health, well, 25 and 26 are the best years. But if you think about it as a vehicle for wisdom, not just for fitness and health, but also for wisdom, compassion, sensitivity, all of those things take a long time.
Yeah,
to be sensitive and to be open to other people and to not be so dogmatic. I mean, these are things that take a lot of practice. And a 25-year-old is nowhere near that.
Well, it is strange when there's currently a TV show about yoga celebrity teachers going on in America right now. And most of the sort of yoga teachers who are famous might be 25, 30 years old. And at 38, I consider myself someone pretty young to be in the embodiment field still, in terms of actually racking up the necessary experience to have any skill in the matter. Though I do see another trend, one is the sort of idealization of youth and the, view of becoming older as decaying and not really recognizing elders. The other trend I've seen from the States, though, is elders not wanting to pass into eldership from, I'd call it maybe being a monarch. So the idea of sort of being still the head of things or in charge of things and not letting go of power. So there's a way sort of archetypally that elders aren't the king. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. It's partly because we don't have a culture of elders that we can't process what it means to be an elder. I have to learn from people in other countries, or people like Charlotte Selver, who was a true elder. I mean, she was a true elder because she was not a queen.
It's a different place, isn't it? There's a different place in the tribe, as it were, as the king or queen or the kind of the elder. They seem to be different to me, and sometimes I see a sort of denial of any kind of the aging process. In people in the embodiment world, like it's like, I imagine you may have slowed down a little bit or doing a bit less hours, or then you're not doing cage fighting at 80. In terms of your somatic practices might be a gentler kind of yoga or dance or something. And I think there seems to be that. That's another way that this can go wrong that I see.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then all of the business about freezing your body so that when they figure out how to make it immortal, you'll unfreeze it, all that stuff.
Well, it's back to immortality, isn't it, with Michael Murphy or the monks who don't decay. That sort of idea of immortality is equally in denial of impermanence, isn't it?
Denial of impermanence, right. Yeah, so how to hold the course between wanting to be immortal and realizing that I'm going to die sooner than I was for sure before, and what's appropriate for me at this stage. Those are hard questions.
Without going into like everything has to be decay, because I totally see all the older people I know who have kept dancing or kept doing martial arts have kept so much more vibrant, or even kept playing with children.
Well, I think my neighbor Anna Halpern. I mean, Anna Halpern's 97 now, I think, and it's amazing the way she keeps moving and performing. It's just great.
Yeah, she's still doing workshops all over the world. Is she your neighbor? In that case, after we finish the call, I'm going to bug you to see if you can introduce me to get her on the show. In that case, if now I know it's your neighbor, Don. Okay, so we've got last sort of 10 minutes maybe now. Where do you want to go with this, Don? I want to just completely free reign. You're a wise guy. You know a lot of stuff. What do you think people would benefit from knowing about who are maybe coming into embodiment as a field and didn't live through this kind of 60s experience? So I just want to give you complete free range here.
Well, two phrases maybe are a good place to start. One that caught me early on is the body is not just a body.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a place to start is to realize, for example, with my hands, my hands are not just a mechanical robotic instrument. They're modes of making love, of giving, of receiving, of welcoming the stranger. So I think that's a very profound, that could be a life's work, just meditating on that.
That's beautiful, Don. Can you say that once more? Because it was like, I love people listening to this actually to sort of look at their hands and feel their hands. And if you're willing to say what you just said, it was really poetic.
Well, as I put it on the screen here, what I'm doing right here is not just a mechanical robotic gesture. It's a gesture of meaning. And so the hand is not just what a very good robotic person can do, because that's helpful in a person who's an amputee, but it's a being with meaning in it, with love in it, compassion, welcoming. So to really feel that in my hand is to recover a sense of my body as not just a body as it's defined in the culture. And that's true of my whole body.
We're just going with the
hands. It's true of my face. All of these things.
And what a beautiful meditation. I sometimes say something a bit similar in workshops. This is an arm that's fought. This is an arm that's created. This is an arm that's been a part of my love and my loss in my life. It's not a piece of meat. It's not a bit of a brain taxi. And that's a little meditation someone could do, just, being aware of the hand on a steering wheel, or, looking at their hand on the subway and, or looking across the way at someone else's hand.
Yeah.
There's a way in which we tend to default to objectifying people, particularly in a kind of rushed, busy world. And to actually realize, that's them too, the person that I'm looking at across the way in the street.
Yeah.
That's their hand. I was born with very old hands. People won't be able to see this on the podcast, but I was born with very wrinkly. Your hands are actually less wrinkly than mine by the looks of things. You must have a good moisturizer as well as a good in practice.
It reminds me of one of my old friends is from a small tribe in northern Canada called the Carrier tribe. And it's an extraordinary woman. Her life has just been, like most Indigenous people, just a series of tragedies and suffering that she's kind of come out of. And at one point, she got a very large grant from the Canadian government to do a healing center for First Nations people up there. And it's a lockdown facility. So she takes people from the penitentiary, and it's a very tough thing. And the healing practices are based on the old ways. And one day she was saying, well, the way we begin is an old ritual. We all get up in a circle, and I go around and I say, good morning, Mark. Good morning, John. And they put their attention on the beauty of the handshake. It was so touching. It's so simple, bread and butter. And yet it's one of those things that if we did this every day with feeling and meaning.
Well, that's nice. Something so simple, and something which, is business friendly, something which is Western friendly, which is normal, but actually can have this profound quality to it. And I just want to invite anyone listening to try that. Next time, hopefully you'll shake hands with someone today at some point. It's a fairly normal thing for people to do, and to bring that sense of full awareness to that.
And I think it reminds me now, I hadn't thought of this until just this moment, but one of the great teachings my father left me is my father always said, when you're shaking somebody's hand, really shake their hand. Pay attention to that. I think that was a really good teaching. The other phrase that means a lot to me is a phrase from Norman O'Brown, who said, in soul, we are many. In bodies, we are one, which kind of totally baffled me when I first read that.
Yeah, say more about that.
Opposite of what I always think. But in soul, if you think about it, for 2 minutes, here we have all these arguments all over the world about what's soul, what's spirit, but here we all are. Here we all are in the swamp of this earth, breathing together, feeling together, looking at each other, listening to each other, attuning to each other, or misattuning to each other. So that level of unity, where we are one system on this planet, is not nurtured nearly as much as these energies put into kind of soulful communities and all that. So I think reversing that and grounding our communities in this handshakes, looking at each other, touching each other, is part of what draws me into this work.
Don, that's beautiful. I think maybe a nice place to wrap it up. You look luminescent and radiant in your 80s. I hope I look as good as you do. When you're in your, if I can flirt with you just a little bit, you look wonderful, and it's nice to see you so vibrant. Actually, it was a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that I interviewed you last, actually. And if anything, you're younger and more alive, than then. I really mean that. So it's been a lot of fun. It's energized me, and for me, that's a sign of a good conversation. Is when you come out of it feeling energized and resourced. I hope people listening have got a lot from this. I'm sure they have. Anything in terms of resources, people can go to your website or point to your books. Is there anything that, I know you've got a new book coming out soon with on yoga and the psyche. Where do people find out more about you and your work?
Well, on my website and academia.edu, and my website's got a lot of information on it, so that's the best place.
Great. We'll put that on the podcast. I'll send you an email now. It's just ask you for links. But Don, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.